Welcome to the Holiday Podcast, where we sit over some freshly baked challah bread every Friday afternoon. I'm your host, Tammy Priest, and it's great to be with you today as we take another look at the intersection of the old and the new. It's been an exciting few weeks launching the podcast during the fall Holy Day season. During our first episode 2 weeks ago, we looked at the Feast of Trumpets. Then the Day of Atonement last Friday, and today we'll be talking about the Feast of Tabernacles, which starts tonight. So going back to last week, I shared a little bit of my faith story as a young Jewish woman coming to faith in Jesus as the Messiah. I shared about my quest to understand how my Jewish faith and my belief in Jesus fit together, that intersection of the old and the new that we talk about here. And I shared about how the Jewishness of the cross finally clicked for me as my college rabbi spoke on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, 30 years ago. Over the years, as I grew in my faith and my understanding of who Jesus was and is, I continued that quest to discover and celebrate how the old and the new intersect and converge, how the old foretold the new and how the new fulfills the old. And I can honestly say that my greatest excitement comes from discovering Jesus at the core of the feasts and rituals of my Jewish heritage and childhood, and then to be able to share those discoveries. So the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot in Hebrew, is a beautiful example of this foreshadowing and fulfillment. And since it starts tonight, that's what I thought we should talk about this afternoon. Now, to be honest, we could sit here for hours and unpack all of the messianic foreshadowing and fulfillment of this feast, which I love to do with groups when we can gather together. But today, since we only have a few minutes together, I'm going to focus on the most obvious piece of this celebration, the Tabernacles. Hopefully, after our holiday chat today, you'll have greater understanding and appreciation when you notice your Jewish neighbors building little huts in their backyards or see a big one outside the synagogue. Now, right off the bat, I do have to start by saying that I wish English Bible translations didn't call this the Feast of Tabernacles. It's really a major pet peeve of mine. These are nothing like the Old Testament tabernacle of worship. They're completely different Hebrew words. They're not even close. The word for tabernacle, the house of God, is typically mishkan. The word God uses here is sukkah. So in Jewish translations, and some more accurate Christian ones, we use the word booth instead of tabernacle to make sure the difference isn't lost. It's the Feast of Booths. And you'll see that this difference between the ornate, well-constructed mishkan and the makeshift sukkah is the key point that God is trying to make. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a sukkah, whether you've had neighbors or driven by a synagogue during this time. If you have, does it look permanent and weatherproof? No. A sukkah is a temporary, flimsy hut, and there are all sorts of rules from the ancient rabbis about what a sukkah can and cannot be to make sure it remains a temporary, flimsy hut, not some cozy man cave or a swanky she shed. So what that looks like is that there can only be 2 or 3 walls so that it's open and exposed on at least one side. And the walls are supposed to be made of branches or unfinished lumber. There has to be enough of a roof, also made of branches, that there is shade during the heat of the day, but not so much that you can't see stars through it at night. And this is a really neat illustration that I really like in this book that I have, because it shows the homemade nature of the sukkah, as well as fruits and gourds that families usually hang from the walls and the ceiling. It gives it a real sense of fall and of Thanksgiving. So for the entire 7-day feast, people are supposed to sleep and eat meals in the sukkah. Now, obviously, you don't see that too often in the United States, except among the most religious. But that is the command in Scripture, and that's how people in Israel still do it. And I'll tell you that Spending time in the sukkah can be very refreshing and spirit-lifting on sunny, breezy days like today in North Carolina. On the other hand, on cold, rainy days, it can be absolutely miserable. So what was the point of all this? What's the point of this command to live in flimsy huts for a week every year? Actually, the point that God was making to the Israelites is incredibly relevant for us today. In Leviticus 23, God said that his people are supposed to live in these booths to remind them of the tents that the Israelites lived in the wilderness when God brought them out of Egypt. And God said that the reason was so that when they got to the promised land and built fortified cities, they would be reminded of their time in the wilderness. And so that they would remember that their protection and their provision had always come from him. The people would remember that when they were hungry, God rained manna from the sky and covered the ground with quail. And when they were thirsty, he gave them water out of a rock. And during the daytime, he led them through the desert in a cloudy pillar, and during the nighttime in a pillar of fire. I don't know about you, but don't you wish he did that for us today? I mean, move here, stay put here, and wait. Especially for people who are directionally challenged like me, that would be really helpful. But seriously, these newly freed people had never been out of Egypt. They needed a guide and a sustainer. And God was both, is both. And he knows us better than we know ourselves. See, God knew that when his people got to the promised land and began to thrive, when things started to seem more stable and permanent, they might forget their reliance on him. No longer wanderers, they might get used to their fortified cities with stone walls and massive gates and start thinking that they had control over their own safety, their own protection, their own lives. So the Feast of Booths was this annual opportunity for God's people to be physically reminded that their true shelter and true safety was in him. They needed to remember that God was still the one providing their provision and their protection, just not in such supernatural, show-stopping ways. And he still does. It's really incredible that more than 3,000 years ago, God was proactively addressing something that we continue to struggle with today: material versus divine security. Do we trust and rely on God, or do we trust and rely on the work of our hands? The psalmist asked it this way: where does our help come from? Well, it doesn't come from giant brick walls or huge, mighty armies, or from safe cars or fat retirement accounts. It doesn't come from our spouses or our children or our jobs. It certainly doesn't come from politicians or Supreme Courts of law. Our help doesn't even come from our Mishkan, our church. Our true, unwavering, unfailing help, no matter what we happen to think to the contrary, our only sustainer, provider, and protector is the Lord of angel armies, God himself. I mean, of course, yes, all of those other things are what he sometimes gives us to bring about that provision and security. But living in stripped down huts is a tangible reminder that ultimately his protective hand and his loving heart are our real eternal shelter, which really should free us up to care for the people around us, to maybe share some of those earthly provisions and protections that God has shared with us. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the key point of this whole feast is that everything here, our homes, our jobs, our relationships, our government, is just a sukkah. They're all just a flimsy, temporary tent. kind of like the temporary tent of flesh that the Messiah put on to come dwell with us, to live with us, and to die for us, so that one day we can dwell in a place that God is preparing for us even now, a dwelling place that is not temporary, but eternal, a place that isn't flimsy, but is rock solid, a place where we will dwell forever, sustained and protected by his glorious, visible presence. I don't know about you, but I am so looking forward to dwelling in that beautiful, joy-filled tabernacle one day. All together, all of us. But until then, while we still live in these temporary tents of flesh, I encourage you to seek and find your sustenance and your help and your protection in the only one who can truly offer them and who offers them in abundance. Next Friday, we'll take a look at the last and greatest day of the feast. But for now, I wish you an abundantly restful holiday in the Messiah.